Welcome back in times with me, Rick Clunn. Uh, where are we at? We're in March, April of 1973, still 1 year before I actually am on the circuit. I'm really more and more involved in following it, and this was my main way of following it, was these Bassmasters. So this is again March, April 1973, and I kind of flipping through here. Here's these idiots not wearing hats again. But this is evolving. So, but this is back a while. I mean, most people that were even building boats didn't know, what they were doing, and they didn't realize how many hours these guys were going to be out there in them boats in all kinds of extreme weather. This particular issue, and again, this is back in, keep in mind where we're at, 1972, 73, 74. At that time, 98% of the anglers on the planet did not think you could catch a spawning bass the way we fish for them now, where you see them on the bed and you harass them into hitting. Most of the time, people, occasionally back then you'd see a bed, but we didn't know anything about it. You'd throw a lure over it and you'd spook the fish, and that's how he'd run off. So again, most of the people, I know there was obviously a handful and you figure out how to catch them, weren't telling anybody. But this article's about fishing the spawning in season and whether it's good or bad, and because a lot of people, obviously, this is the fish is up there reproducing, repopulating your pond, your lake, your river, whatever it is. And so all of a sudden, this idea that we're going to catch that fish, and it's not going to be able to do that, most of the time was perceived fairly negatively. But we really didn't have much information on it. But this article here has a neat little deal here. It says, in the Midwest around my territory of southern Kansas down into the Ozarks, we refer to the spawning season as redbud and dogwood season. And that's kind of neat because I didn't read this article, but back when I started fishing, kind of following bass, patterns across the country, because I was starting to travel. One minute I'd be in Texas, the next minute I'd be in Tennessee, and the next term I'd be somewhere else. Well, obviously the seasons are not going to be exactly, I couldn't totally be accurate about what season I was in, but one of the most accurate things I learned was the redbuds and the dogwoods when it came to the spawn. When you first started seeing the redbuds, I learned and figured out that that's when the first spawn in the lake was somewhere in that lake, not everywhere, but somewhere in that lake was starting to happen, was the redbuds, when they first started budding out. And so when I'm traveling across the country, let's say I'm going from here down to South Carolina, maybe the redbuds were popping here, but as I worked my way down there, they weren't yet, or maybe they were way ahead. Maybe the dogwoods are coming out, because when the dogwoods started blooming, pretty much at least 50% of the lake was now having a spawn somewhere in it. So, and the areas that warmed up first was obviously the areas that were warming the first. Areas that had the most sun on them all day long. You wouldn't go back in a dark Ozark creek that had hills on both sides where you didn't get much sun. That's not going to be warming up as quick as a flat creek that you got sunshine, pretty much all day long in that creek. So that was one of the first tips I used on understanding this progression of seasons, especially when I was traveling across the country. Now, if you're fishing your own lake, you see that and you kind of know when that's going to happen every year. But again, still, and even when they talked about spawning fishing in that article, they weren't fishing them off of beds. They knew areas, okay, they normally in here, I've seen them in here spawning on beds and later in the year. So they just blind cast to those areas. or they learn they like to spawn up against a cedar tree or something. So they learn that, and that's where they pitch their, but they weren't what we call nowadays sight fishing.
I wonder how much of that had to do with not having polarized sunglasses.
We have always had polarized sunglasses. Yeah, that's the one thing that's been around even when I was in the bass club. It was well known that polarized sunglasses helped your eyes in bright days, but it also, you could see underwater stumps that a guy couldn't see with his normal eye or something. So you know, the one sticking above the water, everybody's going to fish those. But with polarized glasses back then, especially in a little bit off color, you can see a dark shadow down there. Oh, there's a stump down there, kind of, which you would not be able to see without the polarized glasses. Here's the first, well, I know it's not the first mention, but this guy, he's telling you what his equipment is, what his rods are, what his reels are, you know, whether he uses snaps or whether but one of the interesting things, and I never saw anybody doing this, but he says a lot of people back then, they used a high quality braided Dacron or nylon line on their casting rails, not monofilament. They did attach a leader to it. That's what saltwater guys did. We had leaders on our lines. My dad, he used nylon lines on all his reels, but so and then they splice them together like all the drop shotters are doing nowadays. Pretty much all the line fishermen nowadays are using a light braid and then attaching it to a fluorocarbon leader that's even smaller, and they use a special knot to attach those together. This guy called it a jam knot. Now, I've never heard of a jam knot. All right, here was when I finally got into, well, actually the Bass Club, that was my reel. It was 5,000, and eventually, that was the first one, but then I eventually went to what they call the 5500C. And any of you guys can notice on that reel, it's very similar to today's reels, except with one main feature that's different. Well, there's kind of two. But I'm not going to tell you what it is at the moment. I wanted to see if y'all can just give you something to think about.
I'm sure it's not written right there next to the picture.
Oh. Yeah, there's no thumb bar. And I'll tell you that story a little later. This article here is, if you'll look, it's kind of hard. It's rice country bass. Really, that's kind of Arkansas, Stuttgart, down in Louisiana, southern Texas. And what they build, and this is pretty flat lands, and where they'd build these diked-in reservoirs, and then they'd fill them with water. They'd actually put a giant irrigation pump on it, pump them in water, and then they'd run the water out of that pond, a big pond, down irrigation ditches like this. And there was a lot of bass in them. In fact, this is what I call irrigation ditches. I lived in a subdivision in LaPorte, Texas at that time when I was in high school. And behind us, actually probably junior high and high school, behind us was one of those big irrigation ponds, and the irrigation ditches going everywhere. Fairmount Park was out of LaPorte, between LaPorte and Pasadena, and back then there was giant open fields and woods. It's not there anymore, but industry's taking it over. But those irrigation ditches and stuff were full of bass. And a lot of my early bass fishing was caught, you know, fishing something sometimes twice that big, sometimes not quite that big. But that would be what would come out of the big irrigation lake to fill the rice fields. And it was kind of you know, I spent many, many an hour back behind Fairmount Park fishing those. And it's actually got in, I couldn't wait to go back there, and my brothers would go with me, Monty and Jerry, and we would all fish those canals. And we would be catching, we'd fish for them with grasshoppers and anything else. And one time I ran out of I couldn't catch any grasshoppers, but we always took a can of Viennese sausage with us or something for lunch. I hooked on a Viennese sausage, and that was my first Cinco, I guess, even though it was a little fat one, you know, what we call now, well, you've heard the term called turds. It looked like a little brown turd, and I flipped it out in the water, and I'll be dang, I caught a bass on it. And of course, by then, when I had grasshoppers, we'd fish them under corks and just set them out there, and you'd be catching, you know, everything, goggle-eye perch, bass. And all of a sudden, I'd be sitting there. My brothers would get tired of fishing, and they'd go off somewhere else, and I'd still be fishing. And all of a sudden, my little red and white cork would explode. And that's when the BB guns fight started, because they'd be hiding in the weeds shooting my corks, and then I'd get it, and then it was full-on BB gun fight. That was, you know, if you look at this, when I first looked at it, I looked at it and said, I thought that was a modern day magazine. You know, we have so many swim baits nowadays that look like all kinds of stuff. And this was actually made by Garcia, who made the Garcia 5000 reels and stuff, and it's called a Mudler. And it's not a whole lot different from all these swim baits that we fish nowadays. I found it kind of interesting because I didn't think that kind of bait really even existed back then. Oh, another quick trivia question. Y'all know, a lot of you know what this is. It's Tom Mann's Little Georges. And I know Tom Mann guys came to our bass club about once a year selling Tom Mann's jelly worms and everything else. And these were Little Georges. And can you guess who that bait was named after? Tom Mann was from Alabama. So there's a hint.
I know one George.
And that was, it was actually George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, that eventually got shot. And he survived. He was paralyzed, but that Little George was named after the governor of Alabama. And this gentleman, I'm just going to introduce him. Some of you might know him here. His name was Glenn Wells. He fished the circuit early on, and he was a really good angler. I mean, but more than that, he was one of those first people you met you just instantly liked. Because a lot of fishermen, they're liars and they're obnoxious and they're fishing for information from you and they're not going to give you anything back. But he was always ultra honest, and every time I see that pipe or somebody with one, I think of Glenn. He was from Tennessee, and he was, like I said, an excellent, excellent angler. Okay, that's wraps up the March, April 1973